The first thing that hit the ground was the duffel bag. It came through the second floor window without warning, without ceremony, without anything resembling the kind of moment you might expect when a life is being dismantled in broad daylight. It just fell, dropped through the Tennessee air, and landed in the red dirt driveway with a sound like a body giving up a dull, defeated thud that sent a small cloud of dust rising around it, catching the afternoon light for just a second before settling back down. Then came the backpack, then the plastic grocery bags, one after another, sailing out through the open window like they were nothing, like they were trash. Like the girl standing at the end of the driveway watching all of this was nothing too. Her name was Wren Caldwell. She was 17 years old, and she did not move. She stood in the red dirt at the edge of the driveway, where the gravel ran out and the weeds began her arms at her sides. Her chin level, her face completely still. She watched each bag land. She watched the window curtain move in the hot July air. She watched, and she did not say anything. Not because she had nothing to say, but because she had learned a long time ago, longer ago than most 17-year-olds should ever have to learn anything, that her words did not matter inside that house. They had never mattered. The window closed. The curtain stopped moving. And then there was just the silence of a hot afternoon in Harlan County, and the driveway with its scattered bags, and Wren Caldwell standing at the edge of it all like a person who has been cut loose from something and is only now beginning to feel the altitude. If you asked Ruth Caldwell what had started it, she would have told you it was a plate. A dinner plate that Wren had washed and left on the drying rack, which Ruth had picked up and declared still dirty, which had led to a sharp word, which had led to another sharp word going the other direction, which had led to the kind of silence between two people that is worse than shouting, which had led finally and without particular drama to Ruth climbing the stairs and returning with a duffel bag, already packed as if she had been waiting for an excuse, as if the bag had been sitting in the corner of the closet ready to go for longer than anyone in that house wanted to admit. But Wren knew better. And if you were listening carefully, you would know better too. The plate was not the reason. The plate was the lock turning. The bullet had been in the chamber for years. She had understood this for a long time, in the way that children who grow up in households where they are unwanted develop a particular fluency for reading the weather of rooms. The tightening at the corner of Ruth's mouth when Wren came in from school and set her bag in the wrong spot. The way Ruth's jaw worked when she was doing the thing she always did when she was deciding whether to say the thing she actually wanted to say or the acceptable version of it. The measured quality of Ruth's tolerance, which was always visible as tolerance, never as ease, never as the unconscious comfort of a person in the presence of someone they love. You can live in a house for 17 years and still feel the particular chill of a place that has never decided to let you in. She had felt that chill every day she could remember. She stood there for a long time after the window closed, long enough for the dust to settle completely, long enough for the afternoon heat to remind her that she was still standing in the sun, and that standing in the sun in July in eastern Tennessee was not something you did without eventually paying for it. She looked at the bags spread across the driveway. She went to them one at a time and picked them up without rushing. 3 changes of clothes, a toothbrush, A paperback book with the spine cracked from being read too many times. A bath towel that had seen better years. A pair of boots with the left sole starting to separate at the toe. A notebook with the corners bent and the cover stained with what might have been coffee from 2 winters ago. And at the very bottom of the duffel bag, wrapped inside a rolled-up flannel shirt, a tin that had once held Christmas cookies from the grocery store. She did not need to open it to know what was inside. She had counted it enough times. She opened it anyway because counting was the thing she did when other things stopped making sense. $42. 4 tens, $1 bill. Some coins she had been collecting for months. Doing small jobs when she could find them. Raking leaves for the Hendersons 2 streets over. Helping old Mrs. Farrell carry groceries up the steps to her apartment on Miller Road. Sweeping out the back room at Pruitt's General Store on Saturday mornings, in exchange for whatever Hank Pruitt felt like offering, which was usually a few dollars and sometimes a candy bar, and once memorably a paperback western that she had read 3 times. $42. She held the tin in both hands for a moment. She had the peculiar feeling of a person who has just realized that the number they have been staring at is not going to change no matter how long they stare. She put the lid back on the tin, rolled it back inside the flannel shirt, put it back in the duffel bag. She looked at the house one more time. It was a fine house by Harlan County standards. 2 stories. White siding that had been repainted 4 years ago. A porch with a hanging swing that no one ever sat on. Flower beds along the front walk that Ruth kept neat and that Wren had spent more hours weeding than she cared to count. The kind of house that looked from the road like the kind of house where everything was fine. Where people came home to each other. Where someone had thought enough about appearances to repaint the siding and put in the flower beds, which is its own kind of statement. A house that was performing domesticity for the benefit of anyone who looked at it from outside. She had never felt at home in that house. She understood now, standing outside of it with her life in bags at her feet, that she had always known she never would. That there had always been something underneath the daily rhythms of that place. The meals and the routines and the chores, and the occasional quiet evenings watching television. Something that was not warmth, not belonging, but a kind of ongoing calculation. A tolerance. The way you tolerate a stone in your shoe when you do not want to stop and take your boot off. Constant low-level waiting for the moment when stopping to deal with it becomes less inconvenient than continuing to walk. She had been the stone. She understood that now. She picked up the duffel bag, put the backpack on her shoulders, gathered the grocery bags in each hand, and started walking toward the road. She did not look back. The road out of town ran east to west through the flat middle of Harlan County before it climbed into the ridges. Wren took it east, not because she had a plan in that direction, but because west was back toward town, and she had lived in that town for 17 years, and she knew every face in it, and every face in it knew her, as Ruth Caldwell's stepdaughter. And she did not have the energy right now for the particular kind of pity that small towns offer people they feel sorry for. It comes with a kind of eagerness, small town pity. It comes with questions she did not want to answer and expressions she did not want to see. East was the ridge country. East was the long road that climbed out of the valley and wound through the older parts of the county, past farms that had been there long enough to look like they had grown out of the ground rather than been built on top of it. past fields going yellow in the July heat, past fence lines that disappeared into the tree lines and did not come back out, past the kind of country that does not ask you anything and does not care what your answers would be. She had walked this road before in the years when walking was the only thing that gave her enough space to breathe. When Ruth was in a particular mood and the house felt like a room with the walls slowly coming together, she would walk east until the mood dissipated, or until dark, whichever came first. She knew the road. She knew the way the light fell across the ridge in late afternoon, going orange and long through the tree trunks. She knew the sound the creek made when it came close to the road and then veered away. She knew the smell of it, cut grass and creek water, and the particular dry sweetness of oak leaves baking in July. She walked for almost an hour before she saw the sign. It was nailed to a fence post at the junction where a narrow dirt track split off from the main road and disappeared into a stand of old-growth oak that cast the kind of shade so deep and complete that the air beneath it looked almost green. The sign was a piece of rough-cut lumber, maybe 12 inches by 6, with letters burned into it in the uneven hand of someone who had done it themselves and cared more about getting the message across than making it pretty. Property for sale. Ask Hank at Pruitt's store. That was all. Below the sign, a gate stood open. It was barely a gate anymore. A frame of 2x4s hung on a single hinge, leaning out into the entrance of the track at an angle that suggested it had been open long enough to forget how to close. Beyond it, the dirt track wound down into the shade of the oaks and disappeared around a curve. At the far end of what she could see between the trunks of trees that had been growing since before her parents were born, there was the suggestion of a roofline. Wren stood at the junction and looked at the sign for a while. She looked at the track. She looked at what was visible of the roofline, barely there, almost hidden, like something that had spent a long time trying not to be noticed. She had $42. She had the clothes in her bags and the boots on her feet, with the separating sole and the notebook with the bent corners. She had no phone with a plan, no car, no one expecting her anywhere, no plan beyond putting one foot in front of the other until something made sense, or until something else happened. She had the road stretching east behind her, and the town stretching west behind that, full of people who would have opinions about where she ought to go and what she ought to do with herself. And she had this dirt track going nowhere, she knew, into shade and silence, and a roofline trying to hide from the world. She turned onto the track and walked in. Pruitt's general store was not on the way to anything. It sat at the junction of 2 county roads about a mile from the entrance to the dirt track, in a low concrete block building with a metal roof and a screen door that slapped shut behind you with the particular bang of screen doors that have been doing it for 40 years and intend to keep doing it. Inside, the store smelled of flour and machine oil, and the particular combination of things that accumulate in a space where people have been buying what they need for a very long time. The shelves were not stocked with any kind of artfulness, cans beside boxes, beside hardware, beside feed supplements. But everything had its place, and Hank Pruitt knew where everything was without looking. Hank Pruitt was behind the counter. He was a large man, wide through the shoulders, with the kind of face that had settled into its expressions decades ago and was not likely to change them now. He had the quality of rural storekeepers who have been behind the same counter long enough to have heard most things and stopped being surprised by almost all of them. He looked at Wren when she came through the door. He looked at the duffel bag and the backpack and the grocery bags and the general condition of someone who has been walking in the July heat for the better part of an hour. He did not say anything immediately. She told him she was asking about the property on the dirt track off County Road 7, the one with the sign. He looked at her differently then. The kind of look you give someone when you are not sure whether to answer the question they asked or the question underneath it. He told her about the property. He did not spare her the details. The house had been built in the early 1950s by a man named Walter Greer, who had farmed the land for most of his adult life and had died 3 years ago, alone of a heart attack that nobody discovered for 2 days. The county had taken over the property for back taxes and unpaid assessments. Hank was handling the paperwork as a favor to nobody in particular, because someone had to, and no one else had volunteered. The place had been sitting empty since Walter died. No one had shown the slightest interest in buying it, which Hank explained was because anyone who had seen it understood immediately why no one would want to buy it. No functioning water line. The well was hand-operated and had not been tested in 3 years. No reliable electricity. There was a line to the property, but the wiring inside the house was old enough to be a fire hazard and had not been inspected since sometime in the 1990s. The roof had 3 broken sections that he knew of, and possibly more. There were snakes because there were always snakes in a place like that. And there was evidence of a wasp colony in the eaves on the east side. And the whole southeast corner of the porch was soft with dry rot. He had been out there once when he first took over the paperwork, and he had not gone back. The land itself was decent good soil, a working creek on the south boundary, an old apple orchard that had gone wild but was still producing. But the structure was a liability, not an asset. And anyone thinking of buying it should understand that they were buying a problem, not a solution. Wren listened to all of this without interrupting. When he finished, she asked him how much. He told her the county was asking $40 in transfer fees and back tax settlements. The land itself had been assessed at a value so low, it was essentially a formality. The $40 covered the paperwork. She opened the tin. She counted out 4 tens and set them on the counter. Hank Pruitt looked at the money. He looked at Wren. He looked at the bags at her feet and the boots with the separating sole and the expression on the face of a 17-year-old girl who had walked out of whatever her life had been and was now standing in his store asking to buy a broken-down property in the Appalachian Ridge country with the last money she had. The expression was not what he expected. He had been behind this counter a long time. He had seen desperation in many forms. He knew what it looked like, the tight jaw, the bright eyes, the hands that could not quite stay still, the voice that worked too hard to sound calm. He had expected some version of that. What he saw instead was something else, a stillness. Not the stillness of someone who was not afraid, but the stillness of someone who had arrived on the far side of fear, who had passed through it and come out in a place where it no longer changed the calculation. A quiet that was not peace, but was something more durable than peace. The quiet of someone who had already decided. He pulled the paperwork from the drawer under the counter. She signed where he told her to sign. He countersigned. He stamped it with the county seal he kept in the desk because of the few other properties he had handled the same way over the years. He made a copy on the old photocopier in the back room. He gave her the original and kept the copy. She put the document in the inside pocket of the duffel bag in the zippered compartment where she kept things she did not want to lose. She thanked him. He nodded. She went back through the screen door which banged behind her and walked back toward County Road 7 with $2 left in her tin and a piece of paper that said, "The 40 acres beyond the leaning gate now belong to her." The walk back down the dirt track felt different. The second time. The first time she had been looking at the trees and the shade and the roofline that wanted to hide. The second time she was looking at her land. That was a strange word. Hers. She had never had anything that was hers. In the way that land is yours. Not rented from someone, not borrowed, not given, and therefore capable of being taken back. The clothes in her bags were hers, in the portable way of things that do not require a key. The tin was hers, the notebook. But this was something with permanence built into it. Something that would still be here tomorrow morning and the morning after that. Something that did not depend on anyone else's patience or goodwill or tolerance. She thought about that word, tolerance, and the way it had described every space she had ever occupied, every room, every dinner table, every car ride, tolerated. Present by agreement, not by right. The land did not tolerate her. The land did not know she was here yet. But it would. And when it did, it would not have an opinion about whether she deserved to be. The track curved around the base of a long slope and came out into a clearing, and there was the house. It was not a beautiful house. It might have been once in the way that plain things made with care and intention can be beautiful without trying too hard. But that time had passed. The brick had never been finished with mortar on the outside, and the red clay of it had darkened with moisture and age into something closer to rust. The roof showed 3 distinct places where the shingles had given out and been replaced badly with pieces that did not match the originals in color or material. The front porch ran the full width of the house and had been at some point a place where a person might sit in the evening and watch the light change across the clearing. Now a thick rope of trumpet vine had worked its way up the support posts on the left side and spread across the porch ceiling in a tangle that was slowly pulling the structure sideways, one growing season at a time. The windows were intact, which she had not taken for granted. Some of the panes showed hazing from age and weather, but none were broken. The front door was wood heavy, the kind of door built to stay where it was put, and it was closed but not locked. The mechanism had swollen with years of humidity until the door no longer closed quite true, and trying to lock what could not fully close seemed like an exercise that had been abandoned at some point and simply never resumed. In the yard, moving between the tufts of overgrown grass and the scattered leaves of what had been in a different season of the property's life, a kitchen garden, there were chickens, 7 of them, thin with that particular look of animals that had been surviving rather than thriving feathers. A little sparse, movements a little deliberate, the careful economy of creatures that have learned to spend their energy wisely because they do not have any to waste. But alive, surviving on their own for 3 years in an abandoned yard, finding what the ground gave them making do. Wren watched them for a moment. 7 chickens, still alive. That meant the yard was giving them something insect seeds, whatever, grew between the weeds. That meant the soil was active. That was the first data point in the positive column. And she made note of it the way you make note of things when you are starting from nothing, and everything that is not a problem is a resource. She pushed the front door open and went inside. The smell hit her first. Not the smell of rot or ruin, she had braced for that. The smell was older than rot. It was the smell of a place that had been lived in for a long time, and then closed up a layering of wood and old cooking and the particular dryness of air that has not moved in years. The smell of a house that had exhaled one last time and been waiting lungs empty ever since. The floorboards were tongue and groove hardwood, dark with age, and they moved under her feet in 2 or 3 places where the subfloor had settled unevenly, creating long, subtle waves across the surface that you had to pay attention to, or you would catch your toe. The living room was large for the size of the house. A wood-burning stove in one corner, with a pipe that ran up through the ceiling. A table with 3 chairs, one of them missing a back spindle, a shelf on the near wall, holding objects she would examine later. She went to the shelf first because shelves in old houses tell you things. There was a tin box with a broken latch empty, a ball of twine wound tight and then left. A coffee mug with a chip on the rim and a faint ring of old residue inside. A photograph in a frame face down that she picked up and turned over. An old man on a porch. This porch, she recognized the railing squinting into sunlight. She set it back down face up this time. The kitchen opened from the living room through a wide archway with no door, containing a cast iron cook stove connected to the same chimney system as the living room stove. A deep porcelain sink, a length of counter that had been built in by someone who cared about having room to work, and a row of cabinets above it that had warped slightly at the hinges but still closed. Down the hall, a small bedroom with an iron frame bed and a thin mattress that she would need to air out before she slept on it. A bathroom that worked. She tried the hand pump at the sink, and it moved stiffly, and after a few strokes produced water that ran brown for a moment and then cleared. The toilet connected to a holding tank in the backyard, old but functional. Behind the house, visible through the kitchen window, a cistern of poured concrete about the size of a small car with a wooden cover over the top. She would check the water before she drank it. She went back down the hall slowly, running her hand along the wall, feeling the irregularities in the old plaster, the places where it had cracked and been patched with something that was not quite the same color, the places where it had cracked and not been patched at all. And then at the far end of the hall, she stopped. There was a door. It was different from the other doors in the house in the way that a person who does not belong in a room is different from the people who do, immediately, unmistakably, without any need for explanation. The wood was darker, not stained, just older, a different species of tree from the rest of the millwork. Something dense and close-grained that had absorbed the decades differently. The door was thicker built with a double panel rather than the single flat slabs of the other interior doors. The hardware was iron rather than the pressed steel of the other handles, a proper mortise lock. The kind with a keyhole you could look through if you wanted to, and a handle with the weight of something made to last rather than made to be economical. She tried the handle. It did not move. She pressed her palm flat against the wood. It was cold. Not the ambient cool of a house that had been closed up, colder than that. Colder than the walls to either side of it, in a way that did not quite make sense, because everything in this house was old and closed, and should have been the same temperature as everything else. She stood there for a moment with her hand on the cold wood and the locked door not giving anything away. She would need a key. She did not have a key. She checked the obvious places, the kitchen drawers, the shelf in the living room, the window sills, and found nothing that resembled anything useful. Old cutlery, a stub of candle, a length of wire, a box of wooden matches still dry, which went immediately into her pocket, because dry matches were the kind of thing you kept when you found them. She went back to the locked door, looked at it for a long moment, and made herself walk away. It was not the moment for that. She had $2, no food, and a house that needed to be understood before she worried about the parts of it she could not get into. There was a hierarchy of needs operating here, and it did not put locked doors at the top. But as she walked back down the hall and into the kitchen, she carried with her a feeling she could not name and did not try, to the feeling of a door that had been waiting for someone to stand in front of it, and had been patient about the wait, and was prepared to continue being patient for whatever time was still required. She spent the rest of the afternoon learning the house the way you learn something you intend to keep. Not quickly, not with the impatient survey of someone passing through, but slowly and in order, room by room, drawer by drawer, corner by corner. She found a broom in the kitchen and swept the bedroom first, pushing decades of dust into the hall, and then to the front door and off the porch into the yard, where the chickens investigated it with great interest, and no results. She found a rusted hand pump connected to the cistern outside, that after some persuasion produced water. She let run until it ran clear, before she trusted it. She found a small outbuilding behind the house, its door hanging at an angle from a bottom hinge, only that contained a surprising inventory of things left behind. A flat shovel, a splitting maul, a handsaw with a cracked handle, a roll of fencing wire, several coffee cans of various rusted hardware, and in the back corner under a piece of tarp, 2 50-pound bags of scratch grain for chickens, sealed in metal-lidded containers that had kept the contents dry. 3 years abandoned, and the chickens had survived on what the yard gave them. With grain, they would do considerably better. She brought a handful out to the yard and scattered it. The chickens descended on it with the focused enthusiasm of animals receiving something they had stopped expecting. She watched them for a moment and felt something she would not have been able to name in that moment, but which she would recognize later as the particular satisfaction of being useful to something that needed you. She swept the bedroom with the broom she'd found leaning against the kitchen wall. She carried the mattress outside and beat it against the porch railing until the dust stopped coming. She killed 2 scorpions she found under the bed frame, not with fear, but with the flat efficiency of someone who grew up in rural eastern Tennessee and understands that venomous things are problems to be solved, not disasters to be screamed about. She gathered dry grass and leaves and built a small fire in the wood stove in the living room, learning quickly how the draft worked, how much air the old chimney would pull, how to bank the heat without smothering the flame. By the time the light went flat and the evening sounds started up the frogs in the low ground near the creek, the insects in the high grass of the yard, the settling of a wooden house at the end of a hot day, she had eaten the last of the crackers she had in the bag from home, drunk water from the cistern that she had let run clear through the hand pump before she trusted it, and laid down on the mattress in the small bedroom with the window cracked 2 inches and the last light going orange in the gap. She lay in the dark and thought about the $42, the 40 she had spent, the 2 she had left. She had no income and no prospect of income, and no way yet to convert the resources of the land into anything usable. The chickens would produce eggs eventually if they were healthy enough, and if she fed them properly. The orchard, she had seen it from the edge of the clearing, the tree line on the east side of the property, might produce apples that could be sold or traded. The garden bed she had noticed along the south side of the house was overgrown, but the soil looked dark and workable. These were possibilities. Possibilities were not certainties. $2 was not a cushion. She filed all of this without panic, the way she had always filed hard facts, not denied, not dramatized, just placed in order and looked at clearly. She had slept in worse places than this. She had eaten less than crackers. The house had walls and a roof that mostly held. The water was clean. The land was hers. She closed her eyes and listened to the new sounds of the new place. The sounds of the Appalachian Ridge at night are not like the sounds of town. In town, the noise is always there. Traffic voices the machinery of a place that has people in it, around the clock, and you stop hearing it because it never stops, and your brain decides it is not information. Out here, the silence between sounds is complete enough that every sound inside it registers. The frog calling from 30 yards away. The wind moving through the oak leaves in a long, slow exhale. The creak of the house settling the old wood, cooling and contracting the joists, adjusting to the absence of the heat that had built up through the day. She cataloged these sounds one by one, the way you learn a place by its voice. The frog nearest the house was in the low corner of the yard, where she had noticed the ground staying damp, even in the heat, which meant there was probably a water source near there, a seep or a low point in the drainage that pooled. Worth knowing. The wind through the oaks came from the northwest at night, different from the daytime drift, which meant the ridge above the property channeled it. Worth knowing. The house settled in 2 places she could identify from the sound: the southeast corner where the porch was rotting, and somewhere in the middle of the back wall where the foundation might be shifting. Worth knowing. She was almost asleep when she heard it. It came from the direction of the hall, a sound different from the house-settling sounds she had cataloged and understood heavier. Deliberate, the sound of something that had weight and was moving with it. A scraping. A friction that lasted maybe 3 seconds and then stopped. She opened her eyes. She did not move. She lay completely still on the mattress and listened to the silence that followed the sound. It came again. Same duration, same quality, that heavy, deliberate drag, like something being moved across wood. Then silence again. Then nothing. She lay still for a long time after listening to the frogs and the wind in the house. The sound did not come again. At some point, the silence between her listening intervals grew long enough to become sleep, and she was gone. When she woke, the light was already through the window and the chickens were making noise in the yard, with the urgency of creatures who had opinions about breakfast and were prepared to broadcast those opinions until someone addressed them. She found what had made the sound before she found anything else interesting. In front of the locked door at the end of the hall, on the floorboards, just where the door met the threshold, there was a feather. Black. small, the kind that comes from the secondary wing of a bird, not a flight feather. The kind that falls when a bird lands and adjusts its position. The kind that falls when a bird has settled somewhere and is getting comfortable. She looked up. At the top of the wall where the hall met the ceiling, there was a gap. Plaster fallen away, leaving an opening maybe 4 inches wide and 2 inches tall, running along the top of the partition wall between the hall and whatever was on the other side of the locked door. A bird could get through that gap. A bird that had gotten through that gap and landed on something inside the locked room would shed exactly this kind of feather in exactly this way. She held the feather in her palm for a moment. She crouched in front of the gap and shined the light from her cell phone. No service out here, probably never would be on this carrier. But the flashlight still worked through the opening. The angle was wrong. She could see a narrow strip of the room beyond floorboards, solid and dark. Better quality than the rest of the house. The edge of something she could not identify, a corner of wood, a piece of furniture, a box. Then the angle ran out, and there was nothing but shadow. She stood up. She put the feather in the pocket of her jeans. A bird had gotten in through a gap in the wall. A bird had gotten in and landed on something inside the locked room and left a feather on the floor when it left. That was a logical explanation. That was an explanation that made complete sense in the ordinary world of gaps and birds and old houses. She went to the kitchen and started thinking about breakfast and water and what she was gonna do with $2 and 7 thin chickens and 40 acres of eastern Tennessee that she now owned. It was while she was cleaning the kitchen that she found the letter. She had decided that cleaning the kitchen was not the quick wipe down of the day before, not the light pass of someone getting a surface functional, but the real cleaning. The kind of cleaning that means something. The kind you do when you are deciding that a place is yours. She pulled everything away from the walls. She got behind the cast iron cook stove, which required moving it on its iron feet a few inches from the wall, which required more effort than she had anticipated, because the thing weighed as much as a reasonable-sized person and had been sitting in the same spot for decades. She got a rag into the space behind it and swept it along the baseboard, collecting years of accumulated grease and dust and the particular grime that lives behind old stoves in old kitchens. Her hand hit something. It was paper, folded many times, stiff with old cooking grease and the carbonized film of wood smoke pressed flat against the baseboard behind the stove, where it had been invisible under the accumulation of years. She worked it free carefully, because paper that old and that saturated with time could tear if you were impatient. And she was not impatient. She carried it to the kitchen table and unfolded it one crease at a time, stopping when she felt resistance working the folds loose with her thumbnail rather than pulling. It was a single page. The handwriting was small and slanted slightly to the right. The letters careful, and even the hand of someone who had thought about what they were writing before they wrote it. The ink had faded to a pale brown, but it was still legible. She bent over it and read, "If you find this, God bless you for making it this far. Don't open the back room. Not out of cruelty, some things need time to be understood. When you're ready, the key is where tomorrow always begins." No signature. She read it 3 times. She read it a 4th time with the letter held closer to the window where the morning light was stronger. She read the last line again. The key is where tomorrow always begins. She stood at the kitchen window with the letter in her hand and looked out at the yard. The 7 chickens were making their deliberate way through the tall grass heads, moving in that quick, precise way that chickens have. Beyond the yard, the tree line started, and beyond the tree line, she could hear the creek running. And on the east side of the property, she had noticed it when she walked the boundaries that morning. The way the land sloped gently toward the ridge and then leveled off into a long, flat section where the old apple orchard grew on the east side. The sun came up first. The trees out there were already in full light when the house was still half in shadow. Where tomorrow always begins. She folded the letter back along its creases and put it in the pocket of her jeans next to the feather. Then she went back to cleaning the kitchen because she had work to do, and because she had also learned in 17 years of living under someone else's roof that the answers to questions that matter don't come faster because you chase them. Sometimes patience is the only leverage you have. 2 mornings after she found the letter, a woman came up the track. Wren heard her before she saw her, the sound of boots on packed dirt, unhurried, familiar with the ground underfoot. She was in the yard mending a section of the fence where the wire had pulled loose from the post, using a length of fencing wire she had found in the small outbuilding behind the house, when the woman came around the curve in the track and stopped at the edge of the clearing. She was somewhere around 45, though the kind of work she clearly did with her hands made exact ages hard to pin down. Hair the color of old copper pulled back from a face that had been weathered into something better than pretty, the kind of face that had been tested by seasons and had opinions about all of them. She wore work clothes that were well made and well used. She carried nothing. She stood at the edge of the clearing and looked at Wren, and at the house, and at the fence, and at the smoke that was coming from the kitchen chimney, because Wren had started the cook stove that morning to heat water, and she did not seem particularly surprised by any of it. "Bess Hatch," she said. "I've got the place half a mile east by the creek. I saw smoke day before yesterday and figured I'd come see what was what." Wren told her she had bought the property 3 days ago from the county. Bess looked at her the way people who have lived in a place for a long time look at information that requires them to revise their assumptions carefully without rushing. "You got a plan for it?" Bess asked. "Working on one," Wren said. Bess looked around the yard, looked at the fence Wren was mending, looked at the outbuilding and the house and the chickens who had come over to investigate the new presence with their usual combination of curiosity and suspicion. "I've got seedling starts. I've been nursing since April," Bess said, finally. "More than my beds can handle. If you want them, I'll bring them over and show you where to put them. The soil here is good." Walter knew what he was doing with the land, even when other things got away from him. Wren said she would take the starts. They stood for a moment in the particular quiet of 2 people who were still reading each other. "You knew Walter Greer," Wren said, "the man who owned this before." Bess's expression did something subtle, not a closing down, but a careful adjustment, like a door that does not lock, but has been pulled mostly shut. She said she had known him. She said he was a decent man who had a hard stretch in his later years and handled it the way some people handle things, by getting quieter and smaller and not asking for what he needed. Wren said, "What about the room at the end of the hall, the locked one? Do you know why it's locked?" The silence after that question had a different weight from the silence before it. It was the silence of someone who knows the answer and is deciding something about whether or not to give it. "I don't know anything about a back room," Bess said. And then she turned and walked back down the track toward the road. without hurrying, without looking back. The answer was too short to be the truth. Wren knew it immediately. She had heard enough half-truths in her life to know one by the texture of it, the way it covers the shape of what it is hiding, without quite hiding it. She went back to the fence. She had work to do. She had $2, 7 chickens, 40 acres, and a locked door. She had a letter with no signature, and a feather from a bird she had not seen. She had a woman who had walked away too quickly, and an answer that was not an answer. She did not know yet what all of it meant. But she had something she had not had 3 days ago, standing in that driveway watching her life land in the red dirt. She had a place, and the particular quality of stillness that had carried her through the walk down the road, and the conversation with Hank Pruitt, and the first nights in a house that groaned and shifted in the dark. That stillness was still there underneath everything holding. She kept working on the fence until the afternoon lights started going long and orange through the oaks. That evening she walked the full boundary of the property for the first time, before the light failed entirely. The 40 acres were irregular in shape, following the old survey lines rather than any geographic logic, which meant the boundaries ran sometimes with the creek, and sometimes across it, and sometimes up the slope of the ridge at angles that made sense only on paper. She walked it all. She learned the southeast corner where the ground stayed soft and wet, and where the previous owner had installed drainage ditches that were now overgrown and ineffective. She learned the north fence line where 3 posts had rotted at the base, and the wire sagged between them in long curves. She learned the creek which ran cold and clear over flat limestone ledges on the south boundary, narrow enough to step across in one long stride at its narrowest, and wide enough to wade in at the bend where it pooled before turning south again. And she learned the orchard. The orchard occupied the northeast corner of the property. Maybe 6 acres of old apple trees planted in rows that had since grown beyond their original spacing, the crowns of adjacent trees touching and sometimes merging in a tangle of competing branches. The trees were old enough to have character, each one with its own particular lean, its own way of throwing its branches, its own history written in the healed scars of old pruning cuts, and the knots where limbs had broken in storms and been shed and grown over. Several had fruit forming small and hard at this stage of the season. But there, a long time since anyone had shaped or thinned or managed any of this. But the trees were producing regardless, because that was what they did. She stood in the orchard in the last light and looked at the oldest tree at the north end, the one that had grown from one trunk into 3, whose roots spread out from the base in long visible ridges, 2 of them running parallel and close to the surface, shaped like open hands. She looked at it for a long time without going to it. It was an old tree. It had been here before the house. It would be here after her, probably. She would learn it better in the morning. She went back to the house and ate the last of what she had and went to bed. In the morning, she went to the orchard first. She went at first light before the dew had fully burned off the grass, her boots darkening with moisture as she walked through the long, wet grass at the edge of the clearing. She had spent the night between wakefulness and sleep, turning the words over in her mind, where tomorrow always begins. She knew where she was going. She had known since the moment she read the letter, in the way you sometimes know something before you have finished the thought. The orchard, the east side, the place where the sun came first, The orchard was a long, irregular block of apple trees that had been planted in what her grandfather's generation would have called proper rows, but had since grown out of them, expanding into each other's space, dropping branches that rotted back into the soil, sending up new growth from the rootstock in thick vertical shoots that made the whole planting look shaggy and unmaintained. But the trees were alive, alive in the stubborn way of old orchards that no one has bothered to kill, putting out new wood every spring bearing fruit in season. Because that is what apple trees do, asking nothing and continuing regardless. The largest tree was at the north end of the orchard block, a tree that had started as one trunk and grown into three, over the decades, each major limb becoming a tree in its own right. The root system spread from its base in long exposed ridges, pale wood under the bark, where the earth had eroded away over the years, and two of the major roots ran out from the base in near perfect parallel, thick as a man's forearm close to the surface, shaped like open hands. Between them, slightly recessed from the surrounding soil, was a stone. Not a field stone, not a piece of the local bedrock, a piece that was smoother than the surrounding ground, flatter with one face that had been worked, not carved with anything, just planed flat and smooth by something harder than itself. The face slightly brighter than the rest of the stone where it had been worked. A stone placed there, not landed, not moved by water or frost. Placed. Wren crouched down. She got her fingers under the edge of the stone and lifted. It came free of the soil with the resistance of something that had been there a long time. A sucking pop of compacted earth releasing its hold. She set it aside, in the shallow depression beneath it, wrapped in a piece of canvas that had been folded several times and sealed against the soil with its own weight. And the stone on top, there was something small and hard. She unwrapped it carefully, one fold at a time, the canvas stiff with age, but intact, dry inside from the protection of the stone. A key. Iron. Old-fashioned, the kind made by a blacksmith rather than a machine. A round bow and a long bit with 2 steps cut into it. The kind that fits a mortise lock of the same generation. Rust at the edges light a patina rather than a corruption. The key itself was sound, heavy in her palm in the way of things made to do exactly what they were made to do, and nothing else. She held it in her closed hand and stood up from the base of the old tree. Around her, the orchard was just beginning to catch the full morning light, the leaves going bright, the air still cool. The first birds of the day moving through the branches above her. She had $42 when she walked out of that driveway. She had spent $40 on a property that no one else wanted and $2 on enough food to get through the first days. She had $2 left and a tin that rattled with a few coins. She had a house that was broken in ways she was already beginning to understand, and one way she had not gotten to yet. And now she had the key. She walked back toward the house through the morning light. The key closed in her fist, and she did not run. She walked at the pace of someone who has learned that the things worth having are worth the time it takes to get to them right. The locked door was waiting at the end of the hall. It had always been waiting. The key fit. She had half expected it not to. 3 years of weather moving through an old house, humidity and cold cycling through the walls. The slow work of rust and time. She had told herself the mechanism might be too far gone, that the key might turn halfway and stop, that the door might give her nothing but the confirmation of a locked thing staying locked. She had prepared herself for that, but the key fit. It slid into the mortise lock with the smooth certainty of something returning to where it belonged. And when she turned it, the mechanism resisted for only a moment. A brief argument from the rust at the pins before the bolt drew back with a sound that carried the whole length of the hall. A clean, solid sound. The sound of a thing releasing. She pushed the door open slowly. The smell reached her before the light did. Not the smell she had been breathing for 5 days in the rest of the house, that deep, stale exhalation of closed spaces and settled dust. This was different, older and more deliberate. The smell of a place that had been sealed with intention rather than neglect. The difference between a room that had been forgotten and a room that had been kept. Someone had cared about what this room held. Someone had closed it with the specific seriousness of a person who understands that some things sealed away from light and air and the daily abrasion of living can be preserved. It was small. Smaller than the bedroom she had been sleeping in with a single window facing north that let in a flat, even light. An iron frame bed against the far wall, a quilt folded on top of the bare mattress. With the precision of someone who had made the fold and then not come back to unmake it. The quilt was hand-pieced. She could see that even from the doorway, triangles and squares of fabric in blues and greens and one faded red that had probably once been brighter. A writing desk under the window, plain wood, nothing on its surface now but the long shadow of the window frame. A bookshelf along the near wall, paperbacks and hardcovers crowded together, their spines faded to a uniform pale. And on the walls, things pinned and taped and hung, pages torn from magazines. Several hand-drawn sketches of what appeared to be plants and trees, a calendar from a year-long past, with certain dates circled in pen, and 2 photographs she could not read from the doorway. She stepped inside. The floorboards here were different from the rest of the house. Tighter-grained, better seasoned, laid with more care than the wood in the hall and the living room. They did not move under her feet. They held. Someone had built this room to last longer than the rest of the house, or had given it more care in the building, or both. She noticed that the window frame, when she went to it and looked close, had been fitted with a secondary layer of weather stripping at some point. Someone had tried to seal it against the seasons, to keep what was inside the room inside. She went to the desk first. One drawer in the center, slightly swollen at the top edge, where the humidity had worked on it over the years. But it came open when she pulled with both hands. Inside, a rubber band that had long since lost its elasticity. A pencil worn down to 2 inches. 3 loose stamps from a decade ago. And a manila envelope sealed with nothing written on the outside. She opened it. Inside were photographs, old ones printed on the thick, glossy paper of drugstore processing. The kind with the white borders and the slightly warm color cast of film from 30 years ago. She spread them on the desk surface and looked at them in the north window light. The first was Walter Greer. She recognized him from the way Bess had described him, a man who had gotten quieter and smaller as the years went on. But in this photograph, he was neither quiet nor small. He was standing on the front porch of this house, one hand on the porch rail, squinting slightly into the sun, with a smile on his face that was not performed for the camera but was simply there. A natural expression caught by someone he trusted enough to smile at without thinking about it. He looked like a man who had something to be satisfied about. The porch behind him was clean, and the trumpet vine had not yet begun its slow conquest of the posts. The second photograph stopped her. A girl, maybe 15 or 16, sitting on the exposed root of the large apple tree in the east orchard. The same root where Wren had found the key 2 hours ago. The girl was looking directly into the camera with an expression that Wren had no immediate word for. Not quite serious, not quite guarded. Something in between. The look of someone who has learned early that not everything you feel is safe to show, and who has gotten so good at the management of it that the management itself has become an expression of its own. The look of someone keeping something. Wren turned the photograph over. Written on the back in blue ballpoint ink, faded but readable, Della, age 16. She set it down carefully. She looked at it for a long time before she set it down. Something about the girl's expression was doing something to her that she did not have a name for yet, pulling at a recognition she could not place. She picked up the third photograph. 2 people, a man and a woman, both young, mid-30s, she guessed, standing in the yard of this property. The east side of the house, visible in the background, the same driveway where Wren had stood 5 days ago, watching someone else's life come apart. The man had his arm around the woman's shoulders. They were both looking at the camera, both smiling. Wren knew the man's face. She had not seen it often in her 17 years. Ruth kept the single photograph she had of Thomas Caldwell in the back of a bureau drawer, pulling it out sometimes, and looking at it in a way that suggested the looking was private, not meant to be witnessed, and replacing it with the careful deliberateness of someone putting something back where it was locked. But she had seen it. She knew the shape of that jaw, the set of those eyes, the particular way the shoulders carried themselves. Thomas Caldwell, her father, dead since she was 4 years old, dead of a heart attack at 38, that Ruth had described as sudden and inexplicable, and that Wren had never had any reason to question or any way to investigate. Her father had been in this yard. He had stood in this yard with his arm around the shoulders of a woman named Della, and someone who knew both of them well enough to make them smile had taken their picture. She put the photograph down on the desk. She stood with both hands flat on the desk surface and looked at the wall above the desk where someone had pinned a child's drawing. A house with smoke coming from the chimney trees on both sides. 7 stick figures in the yard that were probably meant to be chickens. In the corner of the drawing, in large, uneven letters, "Home." She stood there for a while. The bookshelf held about 40 volumes, paperback romances and mysteries of the kind sold in drugstores and supermarkets in the 80s and 90s. A few hardcover reference books on plants and gardening. A King James Bible with a cracked spine. Between the books, tucked in like bookmarks or simply abandoned there, she found other things, a dried sprig of something that had once been an herb, brittle and scentless now. A grocery receipt from a Knoxville store dated 11 years ago. A postcard from a state park in North Carolina with nothing written on it. Small artifacts of a life, the kind of things that end up in books because they were in a pocket when the book was opened and stayed there when it was put down. She looked at the hand-drawn sketches on the wall. They were careful and observant, the kind of drawing done by someone who was not an artist, but who had patience and a good eye, who could look at a thing and transfer its proportions faithfully to paper. A detailed study of what appeared to be a wild ginger plant, leaves rendered in careful line. A sketch of the orchard from a distance, the trees in their rows, the ridge behind them, a drawing of the creek, then the flat limestone ledges visible in the water. A bird she could not identify sitting on one of them. All of them unsigned, all of them precise. The calendar on the wall was from a decade and a half ago. Several dates had been circled in ballpoint pens, some with notes too small to read from. Where she stood, some just circled and left. She did not try to decipher them. They were private in the way that calendar dates are private. They meant things to the person who marked them that could not be reconstructed by anyone else. She went back to the desk. She looked again at the photographs. The girl in the second photo sitting on the root of the old tree, keeping something behind her eyes. Then she went to find Bess Hatch. Bess was in her own yard when Wren came down the track and across the half-mile of road to the neighboring property, staking tomato plants with the focused attention of someone who has done it 10,000 times and still believes it is worth doing right. She looked up when Wren came through the gate. She looked at what Wren was carrying, the manila envelope, the photographs, and she set her stakes down and straightened up slowly. Wren held out the photograph of Thomas and Della without saying anything. Just held it out and waited. Bess took it. She looked at it for a long time. She exhaled through her nose. She handed it back. Then she walked to the porch of her own house and sat down on the step. And after a moment, Wren sat beside her. And Bess began to talk in the voice of someone releasing something they have been holding so long they had stopped noticing the weight of it. Della Greer had left this property at 18, gone to Knoxville to find work because there was not enough work in Harlan County for a young woman with ambitions beyond what the county could offer, and because 18 is an age at which staying can feel like surrender. She had found work in restaurant kitchens which suited her. She had her father's patience and her mother's precision, and kitchens reward both. She had spent years building something in Knoxville. Not wealth, not ease, just competence and steadiness and the slow accumulation of skill that turns a job into a vocation. She had worked her way up from prep cook to line cook, to the kind of steady, reliable presence that restaurants depend on and rarely acknowledge adequately. She had built a life that was functional, that held its shape, that did not require anyone else to keep it standing. She had met Thomas Caldwell when she was 33 years old. He was working construction in Knoxville that year, a contract that kept him in the city for 8 months. He came into the restaurant where Della was cooking. He came back the next week. He kept coming back. The story from there was the story of two people who find in each other something they had stopped expecting to find, which is the best kind of love story. And also sometimes the most dangerous one, because you are less careful with things you had stopped believing in. She became pregnant. Thomas came to this property, came to this house, sat with Walter Greer on the porch where Wren was now sitting with Bess, and asked for his blessing. Walter gave it. The plan was marriage and a life built here on the land Walter had worked for 30 years, a continuation of something that had roots deep enough to hold. Walter had been glad, Bess said. She had seen it in him. He had been alone a long time by then, Della's mother having left when Della was still in school, and the prospect of his daughter coming home of a family in the house again of grandchildren. Eventually, he had held on to that plan like a man holds on to something he has been afraid to want, because wanting things has cost him before. But Ruth's family had money. Not enormous money, but the kind that makes a difference in a small world. The kind that comes with connections and expectations. and the ability to draw a picture of someone's future that is larger and more comfortable than the alternative. And Thomas Caldwell, who was not a bad man, but was a man who had been raised to weigh those things, looked at the two pictures of his future that were being offered to him and chose the one that cost him less in the immediate term without fully calculating what it would cost him later. He left Della 4 months into the pregnancy. He married Ruth 3 months after that. The speed of it told its own story, Bess said. The speed always tells the story. Della had the baby here. A girl. She stayed with Walter for 2 years of trying to find a way to continue being a person in a county where everyone knew what had happened, in the particular way that small counties know things completely and without mercy. She worked when she could find work. She raised the baby with Walter's help, and Walter gave everything he had to the giving. He was good with the child, Bess said. Careful and patient. The kind of grandfather who builds things a small wooden step stool for the kitchen, a swing from the oak branch, a fence around the garden to keep the chickens out. But Della was drowning. That was the word Bess used, and she said it plainly without apology. She was drowning in a place where every face she saw carried the knowledge of what had happened to her, and she did not have enough self to keep afloat in it. She worked when she could find work, and she came home to a child who had Thomas Caldwell's eyes. And every time she looked at those eyes, she felt the full weight of everything at once. And eventually, the weight became more than she could carry without putting something down. And then one morning she drove into Knoxville and did not come back with the baby. She left the child on Thomas Caldwell's doorstep with a note that said, "You chose your family, so she is your family now." And then she was gone. Wren sat with this for a moment. The morning was moving toward noon. A mockingbird was working through its repertoire in the oak at the corner of Bess's yard, cycling through other birds' songs with the tireless enthusiasm of a creature that has collected every sound it has ever heard and sees no reason not to use all of them. She said Ruth always knew. It was not a question. Bess said she knew from the beginning. Thomas told her before the wedding. She accepted it because accepting it was the price of the arrangement, and the arrangement was what she wanted. She accepted it, and she made the child part of the household, and she fulfilled the obligations of that in the way that satisfied the requirements without requiring anything more from her. That is the truth of it. The truth of it sat in the yard between them for a moment, solid and plain, Wren said, and Walter. He kept the room. Bess looked at her. After Della went, Bess said, Walter locked the room and he didn't open it again. I asked him once, years later, why he kept it like that. He said when she comes back, she can open it herself. And if she never comes back, let it go with the land. But he died. He died 3 years ago, Bess said. And Della never came back. Not while he was alive. Bess looked out across her own yard at the garden and the fence line and the tree line beyond it, and her face held the particular expression of someone living with a guilt they have named and accepted, but not put down. I should have done more, she said. In those last years. He was alone out there, and I knew it, and I told myself he preferred it that way, because it was easier than admitting that I had let distance build between us the way it builds when life gets busy, and you keep telling yourself there's time. There's always time until there isn't. Wren thought about the letter in the manila envelope. The letter she had found tucked inside the back cover of a school notebook in the desk drawer. Folded inside its own envelope, the handwriting she had by now learned to recognize, small, slanted, careful. The letter dated 8 years ago. If I could go back, I would have stayed. But I can't look at her without feeling everything I lost. It's not her fault, but it hurts the same way. And in the last line, if she ever shows up, Dad, tell her I loved her before she was born. She had not told Bess about that letter yet. She kept it for a moment longer. She said, "There's something else I need to show you." She told her about Hank Pruitt's counter. Not the day she had bought the property, a different day 3 days later, when she had gone back to the store to spend one of her 2 remaining dollars on a box of salt, which was the thing she needed most and could not get from the land. And Hank had looked at her when she came through the screen door and said, "I've been thinking about you. I forgot something when you bought the place." He had gone to the back room to the wooden filing cabinet he kept there for paperwork and county business and returned with an envelope. Standard white sealed the address of the property written on the front in handwriting Wren had now seen enough times to place immediately. The postmark was 3 years old. The week Walter Greer died, the return address was a street in Knoxville. She had opened it standing at Hank's counter, because she was not the kind of person who could carry a sealed envelope for very long without knowing what was in it. Inside in Della's hand, "Dad, I'm coming back. I finally found the courage. I'll be there next week. I don't know if you'll want to see me. I don't know if you've been in touch with her, but I need to come home. I'll be there next week. 3 years ago, the week Walter Greer died." Bess read the letter twice. She held it in both hands and read it twice, and then she set it on her knee and looked out at her yard with the expression of a person absorbing something that fits too perfectly into the shape of a grief they have been carrying. "She tried to come back," Wren said. Bess said quietly, "She might have come and found him already gone." It was 2 days before anyone knew. "I found him. I should have checked sooner." She paused. "If Della came that week and found the house dark and the yard empty and knocked on my door, and I had to be the one to tell her she stopped, she might not have been able to stay. She might have looked at that locked door and understood that everything she had come back to open was gone. The weight of that landed in the yard between them and settled there." Wren folded the letter back into the envelope. She put it in her shirt pocket. She sat for another moment beside Bess in the noon light, with the mockingbird cycling through its borrowed songs in the oak tree, and then she stood and thanked Bess and walked back down the road to her land. She worked for the rest of that day without stopping. She did not stop because stopping meant standing still with everything she had just learned, and she was not ready for that yet. She was ready for the fence and the garden and the chickens and the 10,000 small problems of a property that had been abandoned for 3 years and was only now beginning to understand it had been found. She hammered wire staples and drove fence posts and moved rocks from the garden bed to the edge of the clearing and scattered grain for the chickens at dusk and built the cook stove fire for the evening. She worked until the light was gone, and then she washed her face and hands in the cold water from the cistern and sat down at the kitchen table in the dark with the lantern she had found in the outbuilding and the notebook with the bent corners. She wrote for a long time. She wrote what Bess had told her as accurately as she could remember it in the order it had happened. She wrote the dates as best she could estimate them. Della leaving the property at 18, the 15 years in Knoxville before she met Thomas. The pregnancy, the abandonment, the 2 years with Walter, before she left the child on the doorstep. She worked out the math. Thomas had died when she was 4. That was 13 years ago, which meant Della had left her on the doorstep when she was not quite 1 year old, which meant the 2 years Della had stayed with Walter after the birth the letter had said. She wrote it all out until the timeline was clear, and the names were clear and the connections were clear, and she could look at it without the emotions crowding out the facts. Facts first. Always facts first. Emotions were real and they would come in their own time. But facts were the thing you could hold on to when the emotions moved through you like weather. She closed the notebook. She went to bed. She lay in the dark and listened to the orchard moving in the night wind through the open window. And she thought about a girl sitting on the root of an old apple tree with an expression of someone keeping something. And she thought about that expression because she had seen it before, every morning in the bathroom mirror of every house she had ever lived in. 3 days after she sat on Bess Hatch's porch step and heard the whole shape of a story that included her own life without ever having named her. Wren dug a full row of the south garden bed, turned the soil with the old spade from the outbuilding, and planted every tomato and pepper start that Bess had brought over in a flat. She rebuilt the collapsed section of the fence along the east boundary with wire and salvaged posts working from mid-morning until her arms told her to stop. She learned the cook stove well enough to produce cornbread that was edible on the 2nd attempt and genuinely good on the 4th. She sold 24 eggs to Ray Dunbar, the older man, 2 properties north, who had appeared at her gate one morning asking about the chickens, and who, like most of the people she had met in these hills, had the quality of helping without asking unnecessary questions. He paid her fairly. He also brought a sack of dried beans and a jar of canned tomatoes from his cellar, left them on the gate post without comment, and walked back down the road. She was not forgetting what she had learned in the locked room. She was doing what she had always done with things too large to process. Standing still, she was moving through them, the only way she knew how. With her hands in the work, with the weight of the spade and the satisfaction of a fence post. Driven true with the small and accumulating evidence that this place was responding to attention the way land does when someone decides to take it seriously. The chickens were filling out. 3 weeks of regular grain and the forage the property offered had put flesh on them, smoothed out their feathers, slowed their movements from the careful economy of survival to something closer to ease. They had claimed the yard as theirs and were expansionist about it, pushing their range further each day, appearing at the edge of the garden bed with expressions of transparent intention. She reinforced the garden perimeter with chicken wire, and they expressed their opinion of this development loudly and at length, and then adapted, which was what chickens did. The garden was taken. The tomato starts Bess had brought had settled into their new ground and begun producing new growth at their tips, which was the sign that the roots had found what they needed. The peppers were slower but upright, which was enough for now. She had found along the south wall of the house where the sun hit longest the remnants of an herb bed, a tangle of volunteer plants that had seeded themselves out of what had once been a deliberate planting. She identified rosemary gone woody and wild, sage in need of cutting back. What she was nearly certain was thyme growing low and creeping across the stones at the base of the wall. She pulled the weeds from around them carefully, not disturbing the roots, and watered them from the cistern with a tin can, with holes punched in the bottom, which was the closest thing to a watering can the property had. On the evening of the third day, she sat on the front porch as the light went long through the oaks, and she made herself stay with the questions she had been working around. Della Greer had left her on a doorstep. That was a fact. Della Greer had tried to come back 3 years ago and had arrived too late. That was also a fact. Della Greer was still somewhere in the world alive, carrying the same story from a different angle. And the letter she had sent to a dying man who was already gone had told Wren something important about the quality of the carrying, that it was heavy, that it had not gotten lighter with time, that she had tried to put it down and had not been able to. Wren did not want to confront her. She had turned this over carefully in the 3 days of work, and she was clear about it. She had no interest in the kind of encounter that was really just pain looking for somewhere to land. She did not want to go find this woman and make her feel worse about what she had done, because feeling worse would not change the shape of the past and would only add to the weight of the present for both of them. But she wanted to understand. She wanted to sit across from the person who had made the decision that had made her life, what it was, and hear it told in full. Not in the second-hand version filtered through Bess's kindness and the years between telling and doing, not in the careful, guilt-weighted language of the letter written to a father, but in real time, in a real voice, with all the places where language fails, a person left visible rather than smoothed over. The truth she had learned is not the same thing as the official version of the truth. The official version is what survives being told and retold. The real truth is the thing that lives in the pauses, in the places where a person stops. Because what comes next is harder than what came before. She had lived 17 years in a house where she was tolerated. She was entitled to the real version. She went to Bess the next morning and asked her to use the phone. Bess had a landline that she used for calls that mattered and a second-hand cell phone that got 2 bars of service on a good day and none on a mediocre one. She also, it turned out, had a second cousin in Knoxville who worked for a county agency and who owed Bess a favor of the kind that is repaid by running a name through a database and not asking what it is for. Bess made the call while Wren sat at the kitchen table and drank the coffee Bess had poured, without asking if she wanted it, which was the way of people who have figured out that the right response to someone sitting at their kitchen table looking like that is coffee, not questions. The call was brief. Bess wrote something on a piece of paper and ended the call and brought the paper to the table. The name came back inside 24 hours. Della Greer Caldwell, 51 years old. Current address in Knoxville, Tennessee. Employed as head cook at a restaurant on the north side of the city. Working phone number attached to the address. Wren looked at the piece of paper with the number written on it in Bess's steady hand. She put it in the pocket of her jeans. She carried it there for 2 days, opening the pocket sometimes, and looking at it without taking it out the way you look at something you are not ready to pick up. She went about the work of the property. She cleaned the gutters on the south side of the roof, standing on the fence railing she'd braced against the wall for the purpose, pulling decades of leaf debris from the aluminum channels and dropping it to the ground below. She patched the gap in the hall wall above the locked room's partition with a piece of board from the outbuilding and a handful of the old plaster mix she found in a bucket in the corner. Hard but still workable when she added water. She sealed the gap against the birds that had been getting through. She went back to the room afterward and left the door open, the north window unlatched, light coming through for the first time in 3 years. She sat in the room for a while in the chair at the desk, looking at the photograph she had laid out on the surface, looking at the girl on the root of the apple tree, looking at her own face in the photograph, which was not her face but was close enough to require the kind of looking that makes you go still. On the second evening, she went out to the east orchard in the last light and sat at the base of the big apple tree in the hollow between the two roots where she had found the stone and the key. The ground there was dry and cool against the backs of her thighs. The light through the leaves above her was going amber, and the first insects of evening were starting up in the high grass at the edge of the orchard. She could see the house from here, the back wall of it, the kitchen window glowing slightly with the last light coming through from the front, the trumpet vine making its dark pattern up the porch post. She took the paper out of her pocket. She took the cell phone Bess had lent her. She dialed. 3 rings. Hello. The voice was lower than she had expected, not deep, but settled the voice of someone who had lived long enough in a body to be at ease in it, though ease was not quite the right word either. There was a roughness at the edges of it, the particular quality of a voice that has spent years in kitchen heat and noise and the constant effort of being heard over the clatter of a working line. She heard Knoxville in it, not the accent exactly which had softened over years in a city, but something underneath the accent, a cadence that was particular to that part of Tennessee and did not entirely go away. Wren said, "I'm calling from Walter Greer's property, out in Harlan County." The silence on the other end of the line was immediate and total. "My name is Wren Caldwell. I bought the place 3 weeks ago. I found the room at the end of the hall. I found the photographs and the letters and the key under the tree in the east orchard." She stopped. She waited. The silence from the other end was not absence. She could hear breathing careful and shallow, the breathing of someone managing something large. "I know who you are," Wren said, "and I know who I am." What came from the other end of the line was not quite crying and not quite speech. It was something that happens when a person has been holding a thing for so long that when it finally moves, the sound it makes on the way out is not a word for it. It is more primitive than words. It is the sound of the thing itself in its original form. Before language got to it and gave it a name and made it manageable, she had heard that sound once before in her life, in a different context entirely, and she recognized it now for what it was. The sound of weight finding somewhere to be set down. They talked for almost an hour. Della told her about Thomas not to justify anything she said, that plainly at the start just to give Wren the full picture, because the full picture was what Wren deserved. She talked about meeting him about the 8 months of his Knoxville contract, about what it felt like to believe in something you had stopped believing was available to you. She talked about telling him she was pregnant, and the 2 weeks that followed, which she described simply as the 2 weeks in which he became someone she had not known, was in there underneath the person she had trusted. She talked about the day he came to the property, how Walter had made lunch, and they had eaten on the porch, and everything had seemed possible, and Walter had shaken Thomas's hand at the end of it, with the particular seriousness of a man who takes handshakes seriously. She talked about the morning 3 months after that, when someone in Knoxville had told her he had married Ruth Caldwell the previous Saturday. She talked about the 2 years she had spent here on this land with a baby and a grieving father, and the knowledge that the person she had loved and trusted had chosen differently. She talked about what the land had given her in those 2 years, the work of it. The physical clarity of work when everything inside you is chaos. The way the garden and the animals and the seasons had a patience that did not depend on how you felt about anything. She had understood in those 2 years why her father had chosen this life. Because the land does not have opinions about what you deserve. She talked about the morning she had put the baby in the car and driven to Knoxville and stood on Thomas Caldwell Street for 40 minutes before she got out of the car. She talked about what it felt like to walk back to the car without the child, which was a thing she said she had no adequate words for and had never found any in the 20-plus years since. You think there will be words for it eventually, she said. You think the right word will come to you some night when you're almost asleep, and it will name the thing properly. And after that, you will be able to carry it differently. The word never comes. You just carry it the same way forever. She talked about Knoxville, about the years of building a life that was functional and even at times genuinely good, but that always had a hole in it in a specific shape. About the letters to her father, the ones she sent and the ones she wrote and did not send, which were more numerous because writing was easier than sending, and sending meant the words existed in the world where they could be received and responded to, and she was not always ready for what the response might be. About the 8 years since she had written the letter Wren had found in the desk, how it had taken her those 8 years to gather the specific kind of courage it takes to go back to a place where you left the worst version of yourself. Not your most selfish version or your most frightened version, your most broken version. That is the one that is hardest to go back to face. And about 3 years ago, the drive from Knoxville to Harlan County in the early morning, arriving before the heat of the day, pulling down the dirt track, and finding the house dark, and the yard empty of everything except the chickens. Knocking on Bess Hatch's door, Bess's face when she opened it, the way Bess had held the door frame with both hands when she told her. She had sat in her car at the end of the track for a long time after that. Della said. She had looked at the house. She had thought about the key she knew, where it was her father had told her in a letter years ago, in the place where he had hidden it for her when she was 16, and wanted a place to keep her private things from the occasional, nosy presence of her mother's relatives who came through where tomorrow always begins. He had written, and she had always known, where had always known that if she needed to come back, she knew where to find the way in. And she had understood that if she went to that key and unlocked that door and walked into the room she had grown up in, she would have to feel everything that was in there. And she would have to feel it alone. And she had not been able to do that. So she had driven back to Knoxville and gone back to the restaurant and put on her apron and done the lunch service and not thought about it for 3 days, and then thought about it every day after that. Wren listened to all of this without interrupting. She sat in the hollow between the roots of the old apple tree in the darkening orchard, and she let the voice come through the phone and did not fill the silences, and did not offer comfort where comfort was not hers to offer. She listened the way she had always listened to things that mattered all the way through without deciding what she thought about it before it was finished. Then she told her own part of the story. Ruth and the driveway and the $42, the sign on the road, Hank Pruitt and the paperwork, and the $2 she had left when she walked back down this track for the second time. The first nights in a house that talked to itself in the dark, the feather at the locked door, the letter behind the stove, the key in the orchard where the morning came first. She told it straight through without editorializing the way she would have written it in the notebook with the bent corners, just the facts of it laid end to end in the order they had happened. She told it without drama and without self-pity, both of which would have been easy, and neither of which was the truth. When she finished, there was a silence between them that felt for the first time in the conversation like it had space in it rather than pressure. Not the silence of things unsaid. The silence of two people who have both said what they came to say and are resting in the place after it. Then Wren said, "Do you know how to bake bread?" She had not planned to ask that. It came out of somewhere sideways, the way honest questions sometimes do, when the formal architecture of a conversation gives out, and what is left is just two people trying to find a way to stay in contact without either of them breaking. The question was not really about bread. It was about whether there was a next thing, whether the conversation had a place to go after all the weight of it, whether two people who had just handed each other the most difficult things they were carrying could find somewhere on the other side of that something ordinary enough to stand on. There was a pause. "I'm a professional cook," Della said. "I've been cooking bread for 25 years. Mine comes out crooked every time," Wren said. 3 attempts. The first one was a brick. The second one was a lopsided brick. The third one was actually edible, but only if you didn't look at it. Another pause. Then something happened in the quality of the silence. A loosening, a small adjustment, like a door that has been stuck, shifting slightly in its frame. The kind of sound a room makes when it starts breathing again. Della said, "I could show you, if you wanted." Wren said, "No rush on it." Della said, "No rush." They were quiet for a moment together, and the quiet had a different texture from all the other silences in the conversation. It was not the silence of a thing held back. It was the silence of a door that has been unlocked and is resting unforced in its frame, not swung open yet, but no longer held shut. A week later, Wren was mending the last section of the north fence when she heard tires on the road. She looked up. Ruth Caldwell's car, the silver sedan she had driven since before Wren could remember, slowed at the entrance to the track, turned in, and came down through the oaks at the measured pace of someone who is not sure what they will find and is approaching carefully. She had expected this, not in the specific way of knowing when or exactly how, but in the general way of knowing that Ruth Caldwell did not leave things unresolved when resolution was available to her. Ruth was a woman of arrangements. The arrangement with Thomas had been clear, and she had honored it in her way. The arrangement with Wren, which had been Thomas's arrangement, not hers, a promise extracted from her by a man who was dying too young to have made better plans, had also been honored in its way. But arrangements end, and when they end, Ruth was the kind of person who would want to look at what remained. Hank Pruitt would have answered Ruth's questions without considering that they were questions she did not have a right to ask, because Hank was a man who dealt in information transactionally and did not track the politics of who wanted what for which reason. He would have told her about the property transfer, He might have told her the address. He might have mentioned the girl's age and the amount of the transaction, because Hank found those details notable and did not filter what was notable. The car stopped in the clearing. Ruth got out. She was dressed as she always dressed when she went anywhere that might constitute a public appearance, neatly, carefully, in the kind of clothes that said something about her standards without broadcasting the statement too loudly. She looked at the house. She looked at the fence Wren had mended, and the garden that was visibly growing, and the outbuilding with its door rehung on straight hinges, and the porch where the trumpet vine had been cut back from the post. Cut back and shaped, not removed, because Wren had decided that the vine was part of the place, and she was not in the business of erasing what had grown here in the years before she arrived. She looked at the sign Wren had painted on a piece of board from the outbuilding, and mounted above the gate on the 2 hooks she had found in a coffee can of hardware. Greer Caldwell Farm. The letters were not perfectly even. She had painted them with a brush that was too wide for the work and had made do, but they were legible and they were permanent, and they said what she wanted them to say. The name of the land's history and the name of the person who was here now, held together by the same hyphen that connected Della's name to the name of the man who had cost them both so much. Ruth looked at the sign for a long moment. Then she looked at Wren. Wren set down the fence pliers and waited. What Ruth's face showed was not what Wren had prepared for. She had prepared for anger or contempt or the cold administrative manner Ruth adopted when emotions needed to be managed at arm's length. What she saw instead was something she did not have an immediate word for, a recognition perhaps. The expression of a person who has walked into a room expecting to find what they left there, and has found instead that the room has been completely changed and is now the property of someone who knows exactly what they are doing with it. Not a small change, not a rearrangement of furniture, but a thorough and irreversible reorganization that leaves no doubt that the previous tenant is not coming back, and the new one has no intention of leaving. Ruth looked at the sign once more. She looked at the farm. She looked at Wren. Then she got back in the car and drove out the way she had come down through the oaks and back onto the road without having said a word. Wren stood in the clearing and watched the dust settle behind the car. She watched it for a long time until the road was empty and quiet, and the only sound was the chickens in the yard and the creek in the distance and the wind through the oaks. She understood, watching the dust settle, that something had ended. Not noisily, not with the drama that endings sometimes feel they require, but cleanly the way a knot gives when the right strand is pulled. Not a door slamming. A door closing properly, finding its frame for the first time in a long time, clicking shut. She went back to the fence. 9 days later, there was a letter in the mailbox at the end of the track. Not a bill, not junk mail, not anything from the county. A hand-addressed envelope in a handwriting Wren knew as well as she knew her own reflection, because she had grown up watching it on grocery lists and notes left on the kitchen counter, and the occasional letter to someone in another state. The kind of handwriting that does not change over decades, that is already fully formed by the time you are old enough to notice it. She carried it back to the house and opened it at the kitchen table in the morning light. Coming through the window she had cleaned with vinegar and newspaper, until the glass was clear. It was short. Ruth had never been a person who used more words than she felt were necessary, which had always been fewer than Wren would have liked, and more than she might have expected. I always knew, the letter said, Your father told me before we married. He asked me to keep you, and I kept you. That was the agreement, and I honored it. That is all I ever owed you. No closing, no signature. Just the fact of it stated in the flat declarative voice of a person who has decided that honesty delivered this way is a form of absolution. She had kept the agreement. She had honored the obligation. If there was anything cold or transactional in the way she had done it, that was between her and whatever she kept in the private rooms of herself. And she was not in the habit of opening those rooms for anyone. Wren read it twice. She thought about it for a while. She did not feel what she might have expected to feel. The anger, the grief, the sense of injustice that 17 years of tolerance, as substitute for love, might reasonably produce. She felt something quieter than that. Something close to completion. The last piece of information she had needed delivered in the voice it could only ever have been delivered in, precise, unsentimental, accurate. She folded it along its original crease. She walked out to the east garden, to the corner where the soil was richest, where the compost she had been building from the kitchen scraps and the chicken droppings had already started to break down into something dark and productive. She pressed the folded letter into the corner of the raised bed, down into the soil about 2 inches, tamped the earth back over it. She stood up. She brushed her hands on her jeans. She looked at the garden for a moment. The tomatoes climbing their stakes, the peppers coming into themselves, the herbs along the south wall, filling out in the summer heat. Things grew here. Things that were tended properly and given what they needed grew here without complaint, without drama, without requiring anyone to be something they were not. She went inside and started the cook stove for bread. The weeks that followed had a rhythm to them that she had not expected and had not experienced before. Not the rhythm of a schedule imposed from outside the school bell, the dinner hour, the weekly cadences of someone else's household, but the rhythm of land and season, which is both older and more forgiving. The garden needed water in the mornings and checking in the evenings. The chickens needed grain twice daily, and the satisfaction of being let out to range in the long afternoon hours. The orchard needed the kind of attention that was less urgent and more ongoing, clearing the fallen wood from around the bases of the trees, identifying the damaged limbs that would not recover, keeping the grass down, so the moisture reached the roots rather than being captured by the competition. She learned these things the way you learn things, when there is no one to tell you, and no manual, and the only available teacher is the thing itself, which teaches by consequence, by showing you. In the yellowing of a leaf, or the softness of a fruit, or the leaning of a fence post, what happens when a thing is not given what it needs? Bess came most days. She had stopped announcing herself or asking if her presence was wanted, which was the particular courtesy of a person who has decided that wanting is not the relevant question. Need is the relevant question. And she had assessed the need and made her decision about it. She brought things cuttings from her herb garden, a coil of new rope for the well, a jar of something preserved from last year's harvest that she said she had too much of. She stayed and worked alongside Wren without narrating what she was doing or explaining her methods, which meant Wren learned by watching, which was how she learned everything best. Ray Dunbar appeared at the gate most Thursdays, ostensibly to collect the eggs they had agreed on. but often staying to look at the repairs Wren had made with the assessing eye of a man who had spent his life knowing how things were built and could read a repair the way other people read text. He would look at her work for a long time and then say something brief and specific. You want to countersink that bolt, or the wood will split around it in 2 winters, or that fence post wants to be deeper. The frost will heave it and then take his eggs and go back down the road. She countersunk the bolt and reset the fence post, and was grateful for the teaching which cost him nothing to give and cost her nothing to receive. She called Della once a week on Bess's phone. Not because she had planned to establish a weekly call. It happened because at the end of the first week, after the first call, she had found herself in the orchard at dusk with the phone in her hand, and it had seemed like the right moment, and she had dialed. And at the end of the second week, the same thing had happened. And so it became a thing. They talked about ordinary things alongside the less ordinary things. Della asked about the garden and the chickens, and Wren described the progress in the specific detail of someone talking to a person who will appreciate it. Because Della knew what it meant when a tomato plant set its first flowers, and knew what it meant when the chickens started reliably producing daily rather than sporadically. She asked about the orchard, and Wren described the trees and what she had been doing with them. And Della told her things her father had taught her about apple trees, about what the old varieties needed, and how to read the tree to understand what it was asking for. They talked about Thomas sometimes, not often and not for long, but enough. They talked about him the way 2 people talk about someone they both know was flawed and are not willing to pretend otherwise, but also are not willing to reduce to only the flaw. He had been weak in the specific way that people are weak when comfort is available and courage is required. That was true. It was also true that he had kept his promise to Della in the only way he could, by keeping Wren, by making her a legal part of his family, by ensuring that whatever else happened, she would have a name and a place in the world, even if the place was not warm. He had done what he could with what he had. That was also true. Both things were allowed to be true at the same time. 3 months to the day after she had walked down the dirt track with $40 worth of paperwork in her pocket and $2 in her tin, Wren was sitting on the front porch with the notebook in her lap when she heard a car on the road. Not Ruth's car, a different engine, older, with the sound of something that had been maintained carefully over many years without ever being replaced. Slower on the approach than it needed to be, as if the driver was reading the landscape carefully, taking in the fence lines and the orchard and the gate and the sign above it with the attention of someone who has been thinking about this view for a long time and wants to take it in correctly. It stopped at the gate. A door opened and closed. Footsteps on the packed dirt of the track measured unhurried someone who was walking with intention and taking their time about it. Around the curve of the track into the full morning light of the clearing came a woman, 51 years old, dark hair cut to the shoulder, a few threads of gray running through it in the particular way of gray that comes in early and earns itself honestly. Work-worn hands, the knuckles slightly thickened, and the palms carrying the specific calluses of kitchen work, not the hard, broad calluses of outdoor labor, but the precise, smaller calluses of knife work, and the handling of heavy pans of burns that had healed and healed again. The kind of posture that comes from years of standing over prep counters and stove lines, a slight forward set to the shoulders that was not a slump, but a readiness, a body that had spent decades leaning toward the work, and had stopped noticing it was leaning. A canvas bag over one shoulder with the top of a glass jar visible above the zipper. Della Greer Caldwell stood at the edge of the clearing and looked at the farm. She looked at the fence lines that had been rebuilt section by section over the course of 3 months. She looked at the garden along the south wall of the house. The tomato plants, heavy with fruit, now staked and tied and caged with the patient attention of someone who checks on them every morning and adjusts what needs adjusting without ceremony. She looked at the orchard visible beyond the clearing. The trees in better shape than they had been in years. The ground beneath them cleared the dead wood. Gone the canopy, beginning to open up in places where she had removed the most crowded branches to let in light and air. She looked at the chickens moving through the yard with the easy authority of animals who have no doubt about where they belong. She looked at the house with its trumpet vine cut back to something manageable, still growing on the porch post. Still part of the place, just no longer consuming it. She looked at the sign above the gate. Greer Caldwell Farm. Her name. Walter Greer's name, which was her name by birth, and Thomas Caldwell's name, which was her name by the legal action she had taken 11 years ago to ensure that if anyone ever looked, there would be a thread to follow. Her name and the name of the girl who had followed it, held together on a piece of board from a salvaged outbuilding painted by a hand that was not yet practiced at the work, but had done it with the seriousness the name deserved. She looked at Wren. Wren stood up from the porch step. The notebook went on the bench. They stood 30 feet apart in the morning light. 2 people built along the same lines, the same angle of jaw, the same way of holding the shoulders back and slightly square, the same expression in the eyes of someone who learned early to keep most of what they were feeling in a room with the door mostly shut. The expression that the girl in the photograph on the orchard route had been wearing. The expression Wren had seen in her own bathroom mirror every morning for 17 years, without knowing what she was recognizing. "You look just like me," Della said. "I know," Wren said. They stood for another moment. There was a lot between them. 17 years of it. 2 lives shaped by the same event from opposite angles. 2 people who had become who they were. Partly by the absence of each other, more words than either of them was ready to say yet, and probably more than would need to be said all at once. They both knew that. They were both people who had learned in different circumstances in different ways that some things take longer than a morning, and that trying to force them into a morning does damage that is harder to repair than the original. Della reached up and unzipped the canvas bag. She took out the glass jar, holding it up slightly so Wren could see the cloudy living culture inside a thick, pale starter that moved against the glass, with the slow vitality of something that had been fed and tended and kept alive. Something that required consistent attention and rewarded it, something that could not be rushed without spoiling. "I brought sourdough starter," Della said. "Bread is less crooked with this." And Wren Caldwell, who had not laughed. Not really. Not with her whole chest. Not the kind of laugh that comes from a place that is genuinely unexpectedly light. The kind that arrives without warning from somewhere below. All the careful management of what you show, in longer than she could remember. and possibly not ever in the way she meant when she thought about what laughing ought to feel like laughed. She laughed, and it was real, and it was hers. They spent the rest of the morning in the kitchen. Della stood at the counter and showed her how the starter worked, how to feed it, how to read when it was ready, how to build a dough that had the right structure before it went into the proof. She explained things the way someone explains things who has done them so many times that the explanation has become clean and precise, stripped of everything unnecessary. Wren watched and asked the questions that occurred to her, and did not ask the questions that were not about bread, because the bread questions were enough for now. The other questions had time. They ate lunch on the porch. Bess had come by mid-morning with eggs and a jar of preserved peaches. From her cellar had taken one look at the situation in the kitchen, said something quietly to Della that Wren did not catch, and had gone back down the track. The eggs went into a quick scramble that Della made without asking where things were finding them, with the ease of someone who navigates kitchens instinctively. They ate on the porch and looked at the clearing and the orchard and the road visible through the oaks, and did not try to fill all the silence with words. In the afternoon, Della walked the property with Wren. She walked it the way Wren had walked it in those first days, carefully learning it, taking in what it had become in the 33 years since she had left. She stopped at the old apple tree in the orchard and stood with her hand on the bark for a long time, looking at the hollow between the roots where the stone had been, where the canvas and the key had been kept through 3 years of weather and waiting. "He put it there for me," Della said, "a long time ago, when I was 16 and I wanted a place to keep things safe." Wren said it worked. Della looked at her. "Yes," Della said, "it worked." They stood in the orchard in the late afternoon light. Two women who had come to this place by completely different roads and had arrived at the same tree. The light came through the apple branches in the long slanted way of late summer afternoons, going gold, making the fruit visible in the leaves above them. Small apples still firming up a few more weeks from ready. Wren looked up at them. She said, "They'll be ready in about 3 weeks." Della looked up. She said, "We should make applesauce. There's a pot in the kitchen that's big enough. Your grandfather used to make it every fall." It was the first time either of them had used a word like that. A relational word, a word that assumed a connection, and named it. It landed in the air between them, and neither of them picked it up immediately. They let it be there, which was enough. They went back to the house as the light was failing, and Della made a simple supper from what the kitchen had, and they ate at the table with 3 chairs. One of them still missing its back spindle, and talked about the property and what it needed and what it could become. Della stayed through the early evening and then said she had to get back. She had the morning shift the next day, and Wren walked with her to the gate. Before she got in the car, Della stopped and looked at the sign again. Greer Caldwell Farm. She looked at it the way people look at things that contain more meaning than the thing itself can hold. "Thank you," she said, "for finding it." Wren looked at the sign, too. She said, "I think it found me." Della drove out through the oaks, and Wren stood at the gate until the sound of the engine faded, and then stood a little longer in the quiet after. The evening was coming on. The chickens had gone to roost in the outbuilding where she had repaired the roost bars for them. The garden was dark and settled. The orchard beyond the clearing was already in shadow, the old trees quiet in the last of the day. She was not the same person who had stood in a driveway 3 months ago and counted $42 in a cookie tin and understood that the number was not going to change. She was not the same person who had walked an hour down an eastbound road without knowing where she was going, who had put $40 on a counter because the alternative was nothing, and the only thing worse than a broken-down farm was having nowhere at all to be. She was not the same. The land had changed her the way land changes people who work it, not by making them better or worse, but by making them more specifically themselves, more particular, more rooted in the actual, rather than the wished for. The land was hers, the fence lines she had rebuilt post by post, the garden that had taken root in the soil she had turned with the old spade, the orchard coming back into production, the 7 chickens who had survived 3 years of abandonment and were now fat and opinionated and entirely convinced the yard belonged to them. The house with its settled floors and its cold-running cistern and its cook stove that she had learned to manage like a conversation, knowing when to push and when to hold back, knowing what it needed before it told her. The locked room at the end of the hall open now. The window, unlatched light coming through. Hers. Not because she had been born here, not because anyone had given it to her, not because the story that led to it was anything other than the accumulation of failures and fractures and choices made badly by people who were not bad, but were not strong enough when it mattered. None of that made this place hers. What made it hers was that she had found it when she needed it. What made it hers was that she had stayed. She went back inside. She banked the cook stove for the night. She checked on the bread dough Della had shown her how to prepare. It was resting in the bowl on the counter covered with a cloth. Rising slowly with the slow, reliable patience of something that has time and is willing to use it. She would bake it in the morning. She went to the desk in Della's old room. The room that was open now, that had windows that let in air and light that was slowly becoming something that was neither exactly what it had been, nor entirely something new, and she sat down and opened the notebook with the bent corners. She wrote for a while, not about the day, not about Della or Ruth or the bread or the orchard, but about the land itself, about what 40 acres looked like from the inside when you had worked every corner of them with your own hands, about what a fence feels like when you have driven every post yourself and know exactly where each one sits in the ground and why. About what it means to own a thing not as an abstraction, but as a specific physical fact, as the knowledge in your hands and your back and your feet of every inch of it. She wrote until the light was too low to write by. Then she closed the notebook and put it on the desk and went to the window and looked out at the clearing and the orchard and the road through the oaks that was now fully dark, and the sky above the ridge that was still holding the last of the day's light. At its edge, going from orange to purple to the particular dark blue that comes just before the stars. She stayed at the window until the first stars appeared. Then she went to bed, and she slept without waking. And in the morning, the bread was ready to bake.